Stop overthinking your story and just write. Have you heard that sentiment? The idea that you can't take something as abstract as art and apply rules to it. You can't turn writing into a formulaic science. Are you kidding me? You can't put art into a set boundary. This is one style of thinking, and it's one that I think is absolutely toxic. Today we dive into the discussion of overanalyzing writing and how it might be ruining your chances at telling a story. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to the business and theory of writing, you can join me every Wednesday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that we can apply to our own writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. Oh, another Reddit deep dive. I love these. For those who aren't aware, we do this about once a month. We mine through the writing subreddits for good points of discussion. And today we look at a totally fair discussion. Are metrics and sort of meta thinking about your story ruining writing? Now, of course, hey, I'm biased. I love thinking about writing. I imagine it as composition in regards to something like visual art. There are definitely things that we've identified as aesthetically pleasing. And that's the whole idea behind things like color theory and the rule of thirds and the golden ratio. All of these things exist because over 1,000 years, great minds have looked at art that people love, and they've asked the question, why? And that's what I do, but, with writing. I want to dissect writing that works and break down the why. Now, some people don't see it that way, though. Writing is something that feels good or it feels bad. Now, my issue with this is that if you want to improve your writing, how do you tell someone that? How do you train someone to just make their writing feel better? And I despise the idea that we are overanalyzing writing. And I think that mindset kind of gatekeeps people who want to ask questions and become better writers. There are ways that we can objectively say, if you are writing for a modern fiction audience, here is what that audience largely responds to. And that's because publishers have been asking and answering this question, my God, for centuries. Let's look at our Reddit post today that sparked this whole topic. And I was going to do 2 different Reddit posts, but this one had so much sort of like meat to it that I was like, you know what? We might spend our whole podcast talking about this. And just hold on. You'll see what I mean. This comes from the writing subreddit, of course, and it's titled, "You People Are way too obsessed with metrics instead of writing." You people! That's a bold start. So the OP goes on to say, here's what they wrote about their idea. Quote, well, hold on, this is going to be hard. Okay, here's what they wrote. And there's quotes inside of it. Subquote. "I have 10,000 words. How many more before I can start introducing the romance subplot? In my chapter, I have 45 lines of dialogue, and 20 of them have tags. Is this too many? This chapter's only 3 pages. Is that okay? Like, holy moly, guys, just write the story. There are no rules to a good book. Any, quote, rule you follow is almost certainly not followed by even a third of published authors out there. Nick Cutter's The Troop has chapters that are 2 pages and chapters that are 15 pages. I seriously doubt a single person has read one of the shorter chapters and thought, wow, that was just way too short. Not enough words. Some authors use tons of dialogue tags. Some use them very sparingly. Cormac McCarthy wrote a whole book without quotation marks, and it's a bestseller. Nobody gives a shit. If it reads well, it's good. Have you ever sat down and read a book afterwards and thought to yourself, there were too many words before the antagonist met the antagonist? No, because that would be ridiculous. Pacing isn't about word count. Nobody is even counting except the publisher. Art of any kind is antithetical to formulaic production. That means you cannot produce good art by following a formula. You can't just put all the puzzle pieces together, word count, chapter length, genre buzzwords, and get something valuable and thought-provoking. Nobody cares about your word count, how many pages you have per chapter, or how often you use simile. Readers care about your story reading well. Instead of running statistics on each of your pages, why don't you just read them? If it sounds like shit or struggles to stay on topic, there's your answer. It had nothing to do with anything but how it sounds in your head. Writing is not a science that can be reproduced in a lab. It's an art form that requires practice, reflection, and iteration. End quote. I have to imagine that the author had that kind of tone when they were writing this because, my God, they really let loose here. So this post has 1.4 thousand upvotes and 174 comments. And before we dive into any of that discussion that follows, I want to know, what do you think? Because this is an opinion, and it's one that probably comes from a mindset of people are getting too in their head about what it takes to write a good story, and because of that, people never actually write it. That's a fair opinion. It's a fair worry, even if it was phrased a little antagonistically. What's the right word there? I think this comes from the idea that, people are going to be spinning their tires thinking about all of the rules or frameworks or advice that writing books and, hey, YouTube channels like my own tend to spout. So what are your thoughts? Are we getting too analytical with writing? Are plot frameworks like save the cat doing more harm than good? And should you worry about anything more than your story feeling good? If you're already in the Discord, we have a whole channel dedicated to these podcast discussions, and I'd love to see your thoughts and opinion there. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, leave it in the comments. And hey, if you're on YouTube, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. I would love to hear what you think before we get to the discussion. And hey, if you agree, disagree, no matter what, if a point comes up that you want to reiterate, reflect on, I want to hear it, because that's the best part of doing these podcasts. All right, we've got the context for our discussion today, right? The OP's general feeling, very angsty, if I could say so. The general feeling that, this is annoying. People are asking too many questions about their story. They're not writing. So let's get to the top comment. And that top comment is, just write the story should be the main tagline for every writing subreddit. And to that, I say, fair. Is there an epidemic about spending more time learning about something than doing something? Absolutely. And the harder it is to do that thing, then the harder it is to make yourself get to the point where you're ready to practice it. For example, maybe a kid who wants to play baseball and is passionate about that is watching YouTube videos of people talking about how to get more spin on their curveball or how to throw the ball harder, or exercises to do. But that's not a waste of time, The idea is you watch this, you consume this kind of information so that you can use it later when you're actually practicing. For the rest of this sort of discussion, we're going to see a lot of assumptions that people are choosing to do one thing over the other, and that people are not writing, they're just asking questions. And they're never getting to the writing part, and I don't think that's fair. So keep that in mind. There are going to be some assumptions like that being made here. So look, I can agree Just like how that kid who wants to practice baseball, they're laying in their room at night, they're watching a YouTube video, they're learning about the practice so that when they get out on the field, they can do it. And that can happen with writing too. Now you might say, oh, you can just pick up your laptop and start writing, or I write on my phone, but it's a little harder than that. You kind of have to be in the right headspace. And I think, especially at the beginning of your journey, because you're doing something brand new, you have a lot of questions. Am I writing too much detail? Am I not writing enough detail? This writing book that I love says that characters should be discovered and not planned. Is that what I need to do? Look, there's value in the idea of just right. Because what's the point of theory if it never has a chance to become practice? But at the same time, it is so dismissive of everyone who wants to better themselves, in my opinion. Another comment says, the constant threads about chapter length are bizarre to me. Like, how many times have you ever seen a book review where the length of chapters was even mentioned? I can't think of one. Yet it gets posted here at least once per day. And the OP responds, I have a feeling a lot of those come from folks who do not read enough to be competent writers. Like someone who has seen a couple movies deciding to direct one themselves. All they can do is try to copy what they have seen, and they may get confused on what is and isn't important. That's a blanket statement though, so I'm not sure why it's so common. And I feel like this right here, from this point on, we're going to see that the OP is responding in ways that are kind of a little demeaning, which is sad. But also, they're responding in ways that exactly informs why people discuss metrics, why metrics even exist. And, they say all you can do is copy what they've seen, and maybe they get confused on what is or isn't important. That's why we break down stories that work and want to understand why that works. That's why it's important. That's why this idea of even coming up with some sort of guiding metric, maybe you don't like it, it's going to help someone on the trajectory of writing their story. Now, there's also this idea that you probably have heard of, that good writing is invisible. And when you are only reading traditionally published books, you are looking at the end result of, most of the time, over a year of a whole team of people tinkering and editing and refining a book until that writing is invisible. That was the end goal. And you don't hear feedback on this chapter was too long or this chapter was too short. You hear feedback that the book lagged in the middle, that the pacing was too slow in this part, that it felt like it took too long to get to the next thing. A long chapter, a chapter with too many words, isn't the issue. It's the fact that we spent so long in that chapter, and more than likely, the reader was ready to move on. So we're going to see this come up a couple of times, this idea that metrics are the problem. You should be discussing pacing. But these things go hand in hand, dude. Am I crazy? Am I the crazy one? Another comment comes in responding to the idea of folks not reading enough to be competent writers. And it says, oh, that's definitely the case. They are not reading books, nor are they reading criticisms or discussions of books. They cling to metrics because they're looking for some easy formula. And of course, that last one was with air quotes. And again, here's where I start to get confused on the difference between metrics and book criticisms and book discussions. One is okay, but the other one isn't. They're all about breaking down a book to try to understand why it works. So why are metrics bad? And the OP keeps quoting things like chapter length. People worried about how long or how short their chapters should be. That is one of the main talking points that comes up here time and time again. And in my response to that, I think there is very clearly a traditional publishing expectation of chapter length. You do hear the metric of the 2,000 word chapter in traditional publishing circles. And you can see this. You can pick up a book that's traditionally published, that's being marketed as a more general audience book, and you will very oftentimes see chapters that average around 2,000 words. And that's exactly what people want to ask questions about. If a beginning author has heard of this sort of metric before, come across this quote, this number somewhere, and maybe doesn't understand why or where it came from, this is a totally valid question to ask. And for this person, it pays to consider that shorter chapter for their story because that's the expected thing for their target audience. But with all that being said, let's get to the controversial comments. For those who don't know, when you're on Reddit, you can sort by controversial. And these may not be the most popular opinions, but they tend to be the comments to a post that have the most responses, upvote, downvotes. This is where the discussion truly is. So the first comment in this bunch, this one's going to be kind of interesting for me to dictate, okay? The commenter says, quote, the OP says, you can't just put all the puzzle pieces together, word count, chapter length, genre buzzwords, and get something valuable and thought-provoking. Now the commenter continues, you are contradicting yourself. If metrics are not relevant to how good a work is, then using them or not using them doesn't even matter. If you want to say that applying some method to crafting your work is always bad, then you are plain wrong. Everything about writing is formulaic to the tiniest detail. You have larger abstraction levels like genre and target audience. You have medium ones like tropes and structure and subgenres and plots. And then you have small ones like prose or character traits or character descriptions. And then you have tiny ones like the literal language being used. Which formulas you apply are completely up to you, and there are as many approaches that work as there are people. However, there are plenty of invalid ones too. Otherwise, every book would be a good book. And a beginner author does not have the knowledge of what is important and what isn't and how to approach it. Your entire post can be summed up in one sentence. Stop asking how to write a good book and just write a good book. First off, banger comment. Second off, great tagline at the end. If only it was that easy. Stop asking how to write a good book and just write a good book. And there is a good amount of what this commenter is saying here that I personally agree with. I would state myself that writing has a formula to it. But I would say that writing is defined by tons of rules ranging from grammar and plots and even the length of the book itself. And these rules are defined collectively so that people can enjoy stories. Grammar exists to create a baseline of language so that people can learn one language. If every book followed a different set of grammar rules, you'd be confused every time you encounter one because you'd have to learn all of those new rules. Even plot rules exist. Every story has a beginning, a middle that raises the stakes and explores character relationships, and it culminates in a big climactic moment. And you might say, hey, that's too abstract. And yet, it's the exact kind of thing I would be working with an author to make sure that this story continues progressing, to make sure that they're raising their stakes before we get to the climax, because failure to do so would be when I would recommend that author needs to improve their stories. And I would say it just like that. I feel like we haven't raised the stakes enough. I feel like we didn't lay the foundation for character work here before we got to that big climactic moment. While we talk about it in the abstract, we apply it specifically. Metrics are just our attempt at doing that same thing without having to point out specifically in your story you have too little dialogue. We can say, on average, you should have this amount of dialogue because we can't be so specific to every single person out there. Now, the OP responds to this post, and they say, let's say I send you my manuscript and it just sucks. The first draft Star Wars A New Hope levels of bad. Luke spends the first 8 chapters screwing around with his friends on Tatooine and nothing happens. I would wager you wouldn't say the first 8 chapters aren't good because each chapter is about 13 pages long and there's only plot progression every 16. Or would you just say the pacing in these first 8 chapters sucks? Approaches like styles of iterative writing Narrative choices, prose, and genre are not metrics. There's no hard rule you can follow that achieves any of these. Is that voice too much? And the previous commenter comes back with a great bit here. They say, it sucks, but why? By what criteria have you decided that it sucks? Because that's metrics right there. And your last paragraph is completely baffling to me. Most of those things are literal descriptions of rules. Genre is just a bunch of rules added together to describe specific outcomes. Language rules dictates what prose is possible and legible. Narrative choices are how you decide to combine these puzzle pieces that are narrative. And I think that's a great comment. Because when it comes down to it, I think there is a little bit of a miscommunication here. The OP has an issue with metrics, and they have an issue that people are so worried about the metrics. And I think the real problem comes from the perception that there is a number associated with it, because that's really every single time that they post, they are talking about numbers. And maybe that's why chapter length is such a commonly used example here. But the reality is, if you are writing this work that you are pulling out from your soul and slaving away and trying so hard to create something great, and you start doubting yourself, how in the world are you supposed to ask these kind of questions? Because the idea that your pacing is too slow is a piece of feedback, but you still have to apply it. And for some people, what they would prefer to have is to say you need to get to your inciting incident by chapter 4, by 10% of your overall word count. You need to be hitting your climax of the story on this chapter or this page or this percentage of your book. Those are metrics that are useful. And someone who is stuck, who wants to make their story great, you can ask these questions and you can use this information. The idea that there are or are not rules around writing, and then immediately following it up with talking about, here's an example where the pacing of my story is bad, and being able to describe exactly why it's bad, shows that metrics serve a role to a certain kind of person. If you like those numbers, use them. If you hate those numbers, guess what? Art can be as abstract as you want it. Don't use the numbers. No one's forcing you to use those numbers. Of course, this is all optional, right? You can choose to never explore this side of writing, and you can just write. I've heard time and time again from people in our Discord community, and I did a whole video on this as a response to it. They were asking, how much dialogue should they have? Now, what's your answer to that question? If a new writer comes up to you and they say, I'm having a great time writing, but one of the things I don't know if I'm doing right is I don't know if I have enough dialogue or too much dialogue. How do you respond to that? I'll even give you a couple seconds to respond. So here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, interesting. That's a great point. Now, were you able to specifically give advice, or did you keep it very abstract? Did you say, write enough dialogue so that it feels good? Because in my opinion, that's a bad answer. You might have said, you should have enough dialogue that characters are the forefront of your story and that exposition and character relationships are developed through dialogue instead of narration or action. You could say something like that, right? That emphasizes how you should be using dialogue and how it replaces just narration or action. And while that's true, how does a newer writer necessarily apply that? That may not be as easy as them just saying, oh, perfect, great answer, I'll do that. You know? What I did to answer this specific question for writers who were struggling with this specific thing was I grabbed 5 different books of 5 different fiction genres, and I opened them up to a random page, and then I counted how many lines of dialogue were there per 1,000 words. Now, don't worry, I didn't do this by hand. I took ebooks and I copy and pasted 1,000 words into Scrivener, and it has a feature to count how many lines of dialogue that you have. And I took the average number of all these things, and I provided that metric. You can find that video, part 1 of my 3-part dialogue series on YouTube. If you are unable to read your work and just determine if it feels good, now you have a metric that if you're really struggling with this, you could just plug some numbers in. And maybe for some people, that's the way to do it. To me, that wouldn't be how I would want to approach that situation. But for the lack of saying you have enough dialogue if it feels right, we got to be able to guide people a little bit better than that. Do I think this dialogue metric is what you should use to continue to judge your work on? Please don't. Is it incredibly useful? God, no. But for a specific kind of writer at a certain point in their writing journey who hasn't been able to find an answer out there, maybe that's what they needed. We can give them a number. It was easy. That video will exist forever, and they can do whatever they want with it. Metrics aren't bad. Metrics are specific as you can be without learning about someone's book and giving them personalized advice. Yes, it's general. Yes, it could be more specific if we did all this kind of breakdown for specific genres and types of story and mediums and readers and nationalities, and it could be crazy. It could be that complicated, that complex, that specific. But of course, I think the majority of people don't want that. But that doesn't mean there isn't a purpose to the idea of metrics. I think a lot of OP's issues with metrics were kind of unfortunately represented as straw man arguments. Things like chapter length kept coming up, and they treated it like someone couldn't dare write the next page without knowing how many pages that next chapter should be. And in reality, I think a lot of the people who are asking these kind of questions to judge their own work according to the general best-selling writer formula as made popular by publishers over the past 100 years just want that sort of confidence. They want guidance. They just want a little help. And is that so bad? Why should you not do that? What are your thoughts? With all of that information, all that discussion being out there, what are your thoughts? Are we overanalyzing writing? Does it harm the writer? Does it harm the story? And just want to point this out. You can ask all of these kind of questions and still be writing and still be having a great time and still be making progress on your story. And maybe you're even in the editing phase and you're trying to figure out, I want to edit my chapters down to a certain length according to what's going to be the most popular option for best-selling novels. That's not a bad thing. I've had a great time with this one. I hope you have too. I think that I've heard this sort of sentiment, this mentality, are we overanalyzing writing? I've heard it before, and my opinion has still not changed. I think, of course, you want to write a book that feels good, but a book feeling good feels good because of a certain reason, and it's typically because they are performing well within the rules of the book. What do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Do you have a point you would like to bring up? Do you want to hop on into the Discord and come tell me about why I'm wrong or what point you thought I made that was totally stupid? I very much invite you to do so because I love talking about this stuff. If you come across any sort of internet posting that you think would make a good topic of discussion, post it below. Come join the Discord and tell me about it. I would love to hear it. I would love to talk about it. And with all the things out in the world that you could be doing, I appreciate that you took the time to listen to the podcast. With all that being said, that's all I got. I'll see you next Wednesday.